Well, good afternoon and welcome to the State Bar of Arizona. Thank you all for being here, those of you that are physically here at our CLA Center, but also to the hundreds of participants across the country. For those of you that are here with us today, you may not know that we offered this free webinar to bar associations and bar members across the country, and by last count we had somewhere between 300 and 400 of our colleagues from other parts of the country dialing in today and to participate. My name is John Phelps, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the State Bar, and we are here today to talk about violence in the workplace. And unfortunately, we have to talk about that because certainly there are other topics we'd prefer to talk about, but unfortunately the trend in this country, and certainly the trend it appears with respect to lawyers, is that there's an increase in violence against attorneys for all kinds of reasons. We recently completed a survey this past year to discover that a little over 40% of our lawyers, members of our bar, have experienced violence of some sort in their professions, and of those over 40%, more than 70% experienced violence more than once. And some of the stories about violence are pretty disturbing. Threats against spouses, people's pets killed, windshields broken in, and of course, you know, the traditional punching and being hit with objects and those kinds of things. So we know that this has been experienced by our attorneys, and the surveys also took a look at some other bar organizations elsewhere in the western states, and it's not uncommon. It turns out that 40% is about average, and in some states is a little bit higher. So taking a look at that trend and taking a look at the recent murder of an attorney here in Phoenix last January, the bar thought that it was time for us to take a look at this issue and see if we could bring anything in the way of information or tools to our attorneys, and not only our attorneys but their families and the staffs that really are part of the legal community. And so we put together a really first-rate blue ribbon panel this afternoon with experts from law enforcement, from the mental health world, and lawyers who have given some thought to this in hopes that we can give you some situational awareness, some information that will be helpful, and really to begin the discussion that we know needs to continue. It shouldn't stop today. We hope many of the folks that are tuning in from elsewhere in the country, as well as those of you here today, will give this not only thought today, but ask some questions about, are there things that you can do in your workplace to make it a little bit safer. I have the great pleasure of introducing our facilitator this afternoon, Susan Wissink. And Susan and I go back a while ways. She and I first met in dealing with a different kind of disaster, and that was during Hurricane Katrina. And Susan is, although in her day job, she's a director at Fenimore Craig and chairs their finance and business committees, and is a very well recognized and accomplished attorney in her own right. She has a love. Well, love's not the right word. She has a passion for bringing legal services into disaster situations. When there are disasters, we know that there are many victims that often need legal help. We just recently experienced the Yarnell fire. Well, Susan's been doing that since 9/11. She was involved in not only the state response, but more importantly, the national response with 9/11. And then we first met during Hurricane Katrina when we were both involved in helping victims from that disaster. She was recognized by the state for her work and continues to have an interest and a passion for this kind of work. And I will say that she was the first person to contact me after our member was killed in January to ask what could she do and what could the bar do to address this problem, and so that's why she's here. So I give her great credit for her leadership and thank her for really prompting us to give this some thought. And I thank our staff, led by Lisa Dean, our Chief Member Services Officer, to put this national program together. It's really been a community effort, and I'm really proud to be part of it and humbled to be a part of it. So without further ado, I turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, John, and welcome, everyone. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. As John said, my name is Susan Wissink, and I practice law with the law firm of Fenimore Craig in Phoenix. And as John mentioned, I've been involved with disaster response services for even before 9/11, about 13 years. And the states, including the State Bar of Arizona and states and local bars around the country, are in pretty good shape when it comes to dealing with the disaster and the ramifications that the victims suffer. But I personally have watched with dismay as violence against lawyers has increased over the past few years. And I was hoping that we could do something to inform our members and raise awareness and hopefully better protect all of us from these situations. So we put together, as John mentioned, an amazing group of panelists that I will introduce. But first I want to recognize, John didn't say much about himself, but before he was with the State Bar of Arizona, he mentioned that we met. He was with the Red Cross, and he has been involved in homeland security issues and done a number of these. He's personally experienced a lot of these issues himself, not necessarily being a victim, but assisting victims. So now I'm going to introduce our three speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Amy Paul. Dr. Paul will discuss identifying volatile individuals and situations. She's a licensed psychologist with the Crisis Preparation and Recovery. She previously worked for the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office Behavioral Health Services Unit. In her current and past positions, she has been exposed to identifying risk factors for violence in the workplace, including risk factors and cues that she will share with us. So thank you for coming. Next, we have our the second half of the presentation will be Doug Northup and Sergeant Phil Brailsford will share the microphone. Doug is a commercial litigator at Fenimore Craig, and he chairs our commercial litigation department. He's received many honors as an attorney, but the reason he's here today is because what he did before he went to law school, where he was an Oklahoma City police officer from 1985 through 1989. While Doug was there, he worked in the patrol division in a high-crime area of town, where he focused on drug interdiction and related violent crimes. He made over 1,000 felony arrests in his tenure as a police officer and over 2,000 total arrests during that time. And he was awarded the Medal of Valor in 1998. Finally, Sergeant Phil Brailsford. Sergeant is a 17-year veteran of the Mesa Police Department and was on the tactical team for several years. And one thing that's really unique about him sitting up here today is he's also a law student. He goes to ASU Law School. So we're excited to have him bring all of his expertise as in law enforcement into the practice of law and joining us in this bar someday soon. As a police officer, he has been involved in surveillance and apprehension of violent offenders. He's trained to counter active shooters in public places, including schools, and his depth of knowledge is incredible. I think all of you, when you hear him talk today, will walk out of here better educated and more aware of your surroundings and hopefully potential bad situations. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Paul.
Thank you. Good afternoon, guys. That's it? That's what I get? Good afternoon. So as John and Susan were saying, we don't have a lot of time necessarily today, so we're going to hopefully give you some important tidbits about what to look for and hopefully protect yourselves better and those around you when we're dealing with these folks. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are some risk factors that you might be aware of when you're behaviorally watching someone, so something overt that you might see. Some common risk factors of just where you work and your employment status and who you're interacting with. And then precipitating factors, things that might have led up to these individuals or this one individual to acting the way that they did. And these are things that you might be aware of. I always like to add in a little psych humor as I'm starting. So you see the squirrel with the psychologist, and he says, when I learned you are what you eat, I realized I was nuts. We all can kind of relate to that, right? All right, so let's see if I can work this. Okay, so according to the CDC and the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety, these are some risk factors for those in certain employment positions that you all probably can relate to. So contact with the public. That's all of you. It's probably most of us, okay? Exchange of money. Delivery of passengers, goods, or services. This is an important one, especially if you're in the court system or you're working in the courts. Inmates are being transported all the time by correctional staff, detention staff, and even if they act out towards someone else, you're still in that facility, in that environment where something might happen. having like a mobile workplace if you do move around for your workstation, so those folks like a cab company, or specifically police officers. And also just working with unstable, volatile people. This is like the mental health field, the social service field, and the criminal justice. So you guys all fall into that category somewhere. So again, you're being exposed to these individuals most of the time, and we don't think about these things all the time. So other work factors, whether you're working alone or in small numbers, okay, smaller offices tend to have a harder time if something is to occur. Where do they maneuver? Okay, working late at night or even during early morning hours, people start to learn your patterns, or they've come to your facility because you've helped them in some way. Working in a high crime area, guarding valuable property or possessions, or even working in a community-based setting, which again, as we're talking about the legal field, that's really what it is. It's a community-based setting. So when you're exposed to all different types of people, you tend to have a higher risk of these types of interactions that could lead to a violent act. Okay, so behaviorally. And these are things that I like to think are common things that we see in people a lot, but I like to point them out because I think you have to think about these things when you're dealing with folks who are in high emotional states, who might be dealing with certain losses that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So when we look at someone who's tearful, or someone who looks like they're afraid or paranoid, okay, something that, most of us can kind of keep it together in most situations, but for whatever reason, these folks can't. Okay, so that kind of elevates, is this person capable of doing something else? Okay, some of these folks have mental health issues. So are they speaking to people that aren't necessarily there? Are they kind of having a private conversation and it just looks strange? There's something just not right about their interaction because they're not interacting with anyone specifically. Are they darting their eyes? Are they looking around a lot? Okay, coming back to that paranoid. Then what about the person who's overtly angry or very irritable? I think there's a misconception that if someone is that angry, we tend not to take them that seriously because it's usually the quiet ones, right, who act out. Not necessarily. Sometimes this is the precursor. I'm telling you how angry I am. This is what's upsetting me, and then I'm going to act out. And then if we're talking to someone and we realize they're not really getting what we're saying, we're having to repeat our questions, they're repeating what they're saying, there's something that's not right, that these people are having difficulty processing information. It doesn't mean someone's going to be violent necessarily, but again, this is kind of a risk factor or a cue that you could pick up on that, maybe there's something else going on here that I have to be more aware of. When we're talking about precipitating factors, and these are the ones that I really want you guys to think about, because a lot of times you have access to this information, you've interacted with these folks, or you know something about them, that you can kind of, when you look at the social scope, you can say, yeah, I could kind of see where all of this kind of fits into a pattern that might lead this person to behave in a certain way. So for instance, when we're talking about mental precipitants, when someone has a loss, or what they consider a perceived loss, when you're dealing with folks with custody issues, okay, they're losing their children, they're losing their home to foreclosure, there's a bankruptcy, so there's a financial loss of status, they're getting divorced, or they're getting demoted, or they're losing their job completely. These are all losses where it raises that risk. Maintaining self-esteem. Again, these are folks who now they've had these losses, okay, and now their self-esteem has been hit. They're more likely to act out because now they have nothing. Okay, or they feel that they have nothing. Emotional precipitating factors is someone that goes hand in hand with some of those behavioral cues we talked about. Are we talking about someone who's really fearful, okay, who is in fear of losing everything, like we said, or are they having fear because now they don't know what they're going to do next? Displaced anger. Their ex-wife is really the one who divorced them and left them for somebody else, but you're the attorney or the judge who interfered. Okay, now you said I only get to see my kids 50% of the time. Okay, so they will displace their anger onto another person. And then the one that's a huge risk is some type of despair or hopelessness. And a lot of times with those we see an increase for suicide risk, which can affect you as well because a lot of times these folks will act violently first and then take their own lives. And things you can listen for is, there's nothing left for me. They'll say statements like that. Or I have nothing, what else am I going to do? What's the difference? Those types of hopeless kind of statements are things that we want to pay attention to. When we're talking about psychological or even physiological factors that might play a role, Drug-induced. These folks might be on drugs. You might necessarily know that. They might be acting different. Again, go back to the darting eyes, the paranoia, maybe someone who's overtly angry, but they might be on something. Or we have something on the other spectrum of someone who doesn't have any drugs on board, and that's a problem because there is a mental health issue. So whether it's a financial reason or for whatever reason they stop taking their medication, and you guys don't know that, but now that's not maintaining the behavior that maybe usually they can maintain when they do have the medication on board. Pain. People don't think about this, but chronic pain plays a huge role in how people feel about themselves and how they view the world. And so when you're not paying attention, you're not listening, hey, I'm in pain, I've lost my job, I lost my money, they tend to act out as well. Someone who has poor judgment, impulse control, which can come with mental health issues. And then my little seesaw there, if you look at that, most people who heightened emotions don't have rational thought. Okay, so you're trying to be logical with someone who's up here and their thought process is down here. We got to get them to come back down on their emotions so we can get them back to a logical thought process. Okay, and last slide, social precipitants. A lot of these folks sometimes just act out because they're saving face. They're embarrassed. Okay, they might be in front of their family, and so they're acting out because now, again, you might have they perceive that you've taken something from them. Attention seeking, they have a statement to make, so this is why they're acting out. Or power struggle with authority, you guys being the authority, attorneys, judges, anyone in the justice system who might be taking something again from them. And then, invaded space, especially if we're talking about transporting prisoners or inmates, handcuffs, things like that, now you're again invading their space. So these are just some of the things that you guys can look out for. Before I know I have a few minutes, I just want
a question for you from someone on the web.
Okay, just want to give you guys some stats because I think it's important. Sorry, I dropped my little doohickey here. Okay, Bureau of Labor Statistics Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illness said there were 13,827 workplace homicides between, make sure I get those numbers right, 1992 and 2010. That averages 700 workplace homicides a year. That's 700 too many. And then in 2009, the Bureau of Justice Statistics said that in the workplace, non-fatal type of assaults or victimization, there were 572,000 just in 2009 alone. And so going back to the number that John was saying, 70% of, just in Arizona, of attorneys said even twice they've somehow been assaulted or there's been a workplace violence issue. I'll go for that.
Okay, so we have a couple more minutes until our next speakers start, and we have people on the web who are asking questions. If any of you have a quick question for Dr. Paul, we'll entertain that now, and we have time at the end to do that. So first, I'll come to you second. Someone on the web said, what is the appropriate thing to do if a deponent, but that could transfer to any person that you're adverse to in a situation, says that they are researching everything about the lawyer, including his home, spouse, child, etc.?
Well, I think that's a pretty huge risk factor, right? Someone's telling you that they're trying to find out a lot of information about you. I think at that point you make a decision, do I go on assisting this individual? In the mental health field, there are a lot of times that I have to cut off my relationship with someone based on I feel a fear or there's a risk that I feel is at me. Obviously, I have to do that appropriately, whatever ethics you guys have to follow in your field. But I think you should take those types of threats, so to speak, seriously.
Okay, another question?
You mentioned people who are emotionally unstable and you can't rationalize with them. It can just drive them to be more emotional. But what should you do in that situation?
That's a good question. Timing's a factor here for us. And so I think one of the things is that you have to listen to these folks and pay attention to what they're saying. And, a lot of times just saying, I hear you're really frustrated. I can see that you're really upset. Sometimes that pure empathy that you're trying to give, even if you really, you don't have the time or you think you don't have the time, those few words might make a difference in just allowing the person to de-escalate a little bit. Now, in a huge situation where there's someone already violent and active, I'm not telling you to do that, and I'm going to pass it on to these guys to talk about those things. But this is why this topic, we need to have this bigger conversation, because those types of questions, it's a good question.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. For those of you that can't tell us apart, I'm Phil Brailsford. This is Doug. It is our hope that between the two of us, with our experiences with law enforcement and with Doug's with litigation and dealing with clients, that we can give you some better insight into making your workplace a little safer. And then towards the end, or the last portion that we'll discuss, is probably the worst kind of scenario you could find yourself in, and that's an active shooter situation at work. And so,
one of the things before we get started that I don't know if Susan mentioned, but I think is pretty relevant here in terms of what Sergeant Brailsford has done. He also was an Army Special Forces Ranger fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan.
I was not a Ranger. I went to college. Sorry.
Okay.
Army Special Forces.
Okay.
I know you didn't mean to insult me like that, but no, I have nothing but love for Rangers. But
okay, but you're college educated.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I never realized that distinction before. So in terms of somebody who's been there, done that, we have a really outstanding resource with, if I call him Phil as opposed to Sergeant Brailsford, I've already offended him, so I can't do any worse than I have so far.
No, we're good friends. But I want to start off with letting you know right now up front that your safety is your responsibility. It's not mine. It's yours. Okay? I'm going to let that sink in, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later.
One of the things that we all need to be thinking about now, and with the earlier homicide that happened this year, it brings it to the forefront, and then it's real easy to forget. But you really need to think about whether you're a small law firm, a large law firm, or whatever business you happen to be in. What does my workplace look like? How easy is it for people to get into that workplace? And what kind of procedures do we have in place? Because it's too easy to say, this will never happen to me. You heard the statistics from Dr. Paul. It's shocking the number of incidents and just the ones that turn into fatalities. But make a plan and think about it. As we note on the slide here, a lot of law enforcement agencies will actually come in and do free assessments of your office and make yourself easy targets are the ones that are always taken. If somebody's really wants to take you out, there's probably not a lot you can do about it, even if you're wearing a uniform and a bulletproof vest and a gun. But don't make yourself an easy target.
Yeah, and I would add that if you find yourself in a situation where you're dealing with maybe a potentially confrontational client, maybe your depositions in the past haven't gone very well, maybe there's been some threats, I want you to realize you can hire off-duty police officers for a period of time, 2 to 3 hours, $30, $35 an hour to stand by as you have that meeting. So you can increase and lower your level of security as you need to, and that's pretty inexpensive insurance if you ask me.
Well, and you also can, I've had situations where I was uncomfortable with a person. They were giving me vibes, they had made threats or whatever. You can, there are rooms down at the courthouse, Maricopa County Superior Court, where you can take depositions, get them behind that security screen. And situational awareness you're going to hear us talk a lot about today, and don't underreact. I had a case years ago where the opposing party, for reasons I won't go into the details, but he went armed all the time. But we started every deposition with him by my saying, and he happened to be a doctor, are you carrying any weapons today? And he would say, no. And I'd say, I'd make him show me his waistband and his pant legs. Well, if he didn't want to do that, or if he got nervous or something like that, I was going to just walk out of the depot. But don't be afraid of that, and don't ever say, well, it's probably going to be nothing, because underreacting could get you killed faster probably than anything.
And Doug, I'm actually going to interrupt you with a question that came in because it's directly on point with what you're talking about right now, and I know you'll get into it more. But someone asked, what can you do if you believe someone brought a gun to their deposition?
Well, I mean, you can, if I had much of a suspicion about that, I would cancel the deposition. Something would come up and we'd reschedule it, and it would be somewhere in a secured area. In the situation I was talking about, this gentleman had reasons for carrying a gun that if he would have said, yes, I have a weapon, I wouldn't have freaked out in and of itself. But in a general circumstance, and look at what people are it's real easy to tell. I mean, I've got a big old honking cell phone on and stuff like that. But you can look at people and look around their waistbands, their ankles. If you see bulges that don't look right or something, and it's real easy, I mean, in a deposition maybe not, but you can accidentally bump into somebody and get a feel if there's something there. And if you don't feel right about it, just back away and start over again.
Yeah. Well, back when I was working undercover, a particular place I would go into for buying drugs, it was always a lady would come up and hug you. And it was always around the waist. I knew she was feeling for guns, something like, it was every single time we did that. So just kind of an accidental, or, it's a story there to go along with that. But we'll go to the next slide. If you find yourself in a situation where maybe there's been some threats, maybe a little concern over some litigation that's going on, I recommend using a buddy system. We use this in law enforcement. If you've been assigned to a beat or an area that is particularly hazardous, then we're going to assign a two-man unit to that. Same thing military. When we're deployed somewhere that's hazardous, we have a buddy system. Don't go anywhere without your buddy. You might have outdoor restrooms that require a separate key late at night. Don't be going out there by yourself. Go with a buddy. We also like to keep our trees and brush trimmed as much as we can, because we want to see that approach as far as we can to the entry of the building. It gives you as much advance warning as who's coming to your building. And then you also want to have security measures in place for people working late at night, maybe escorts to the parking lot, etc.
Well, and in terms of the escorts, it's very typical to say, well, we can have our female attorneys or paralegals. If you go out after night, we'll get security. Well, you know what? I don't care who you are. Depending on your area and the time of night, don't be proud about it, because if you think there's a reason for a threat or something like that, and I think we're going to lead into the next session or section here about the trees and foliage. It's really important to have somebody in your office who is at least somewhat in charge of reacting, calling the police, doing things like that. And if that person's a receptionist and they can look outside, if you see somebody come walking in and they've got a gun or something like that, call the police. Even if it's, we had one of our partners a few years ago that was transferring a BB gun in the parking lot to another partner, and they didn't think, apparently nobody told them that wasn't a great idea, and it ended up provoking a SWAT response, which I thought was pretty humorous when they came and rousted them out of their offices. But, if you see something that doesn't look right, just don't assume it's a couple of goofy lawyers transferring a BB gun. Have somebody who's in charge of reacting to that situation.
Yeah, definitely. I also recommend, we want to keep the workplace from where we greet people, kind of the public area, to where we actually work. We want to keep those separate and secure as much as we can. And one thing that helps with that is we want to escort visitors from the greeting area, the lobby area, back to the workplace for the meeting, whatever, and then have them escorted back out. I also suggest like some kind of a badging system, so it's easy to recognize people who belong and who don't belong. If you see someone walking around the hallway with a visitor badge, maybe they need some help getting to where they need to be. And keep in mind, some places you might work may only be a few people, a few attorneys, and others there may be hundreds of people working in that building. So definitely the more people you have there, something with that badging system would probably be beneficial.
And the smaller offices are frankly probably one of the biggest challenges, because if you're a sole practitioner or something like that, you want to have your clients where they can find you accessible and things like that. But think about having a locked doorway, before somebody goes back into the main offices, because the receptionist could get in trouble, or at least an emergency lock that can be pressed or something like that, because you don't want somebody where they can just burst in. A very good friend of mine lost his father in a shooting a couple of years ago, who was an attorney, had been involved in a real violent divorce and lost his life because a guy just barged in and shot him. And whether you can really prevent something like that, but think about some of those things, and if you have a security assessment done, they can give you some of those little tips, and a lot of times it's buying yourself a few seconds so you can get the heck out of there.
Yeah. And back to this last bullet point on this slide, keeping employees informed. At a minimum, the receptionist or the security person, whoever's greeting people, probably needs to have an idea of who's coming in that day, and if they should expect something. If there's been problems in the past with this client or the person that's coming in, they need that information beforehand.
Yeah, and make sure that person, we actually have a couple of receptionists that are, I don't know, they are on top of things. If somebody's there who's not supposed to be there, they ask them. If somebody's there after hours, they ask them. And we actually have a protocol in place for what they're supposed to do and who's in charge of contacting security or the police or whatever. I learned a few years ago that actually one of the second or third layers was they would call myself or Scott Finnicle, who's my partner, that's a Phoenix Police Reserve officer, and I didn't remember that being in the job description that they would call us. But have a plan and make sure it's not somebody thinking, well, somebody else will call the police, somebody else will get a general alert out, that type of thing.
Along with the assessment of the facility that you work at, there probably should be a training plan. You've actually thought about how to handle workplace violence. At a bare minimum, I recommend doing this once a year, where you just make sure everyone knows the exit buildings. You're probably not going to be able to get out the front door in the event of an active shooter type scenario, but you need to know where the exit doors are, and then there needs to be a plan in place for notifying law enforcement. Procedure for that.
And this is kind of what we were talking about before. And again, I think it just comes down to plan. Make sure, at our firm, you can go to the reception floor during business hours without a card. If you go to any of the other floors, you have to card yourself down. But occasionally, we'll have somebody who's just wandering around on a floor, and it's a large enough office that you might not know anyone. And we really encourage people to say, if you see somebody who doesn't look right, just go up and say to them, can I help you? Who are you looking for? And I've had a couple of times where I did that and somebody just kind of got on the elevator and got out of there. Now, I don't know if they were really up to no good, but a lot of times just being recognized that they're there. A lot of times these people are trying to build up their courage to maybe do something or confront somebody. And so try to get all your people to be aware, and you don't have to be rude or anything of the kind. It's like the receptionist I was telling you about. She'll go up to people who are clients and things like that, and it's like, well, it's 5 till 8 and it's not business hours. How did you get up on the floor? And can I call anybody for you? That type of thing. But it's really good to have that plan, and I agree with Phil, at least once a year or so, run through whatever your plan is. We have fire drills, and everybody goes and remembers where the exit is and how you go down the stairs or whatever. But one thing, we'll get into this a little bit more later on, if you get in that situation, I was involved in one shooting, I've been involved in a lot of close situations, and I don't care how well trained you are, Phil, we've seen combat, when that happens, there's just an icy fear that grips you, and what you're going to resort to is your training and what you've learned. And if you've trained, you're going to follow it. If you haven't trained, you may panic or you may just freeze up.
Absolutely. I agree. Back to the facility design, at a minimum, like we said, know how to get out. You probably won't be able to escape through the front door, so you need to know the back exits, side exits. An important thing to know is make sure is that these other doors, there's no access from the outside. The doors, you can only get out from them. This helps control. We want to control as much as we can the funnel for people coming in and out of the building. Okay, we don't want people having access to the back. And then I already discussed keeping those areas separate.
In terms, and again, we're kind of maybe getting a little repetitive here, but try to have a funnel, one way in, one way out, and then just think about as Phil said. It's kind of almost if it were a one-way street. People come in the front, and if something bad happens, you go out the back. And like I say, so often, especially if you figure out, most of the time somebody's going to come in and they're going to have a particular target in mind. If you can get that person out, that may not stop the situation, but it certainly can diffuse it.
A couple of ideas on, you don't necessarily need all of these, but it is good if you can control the access, locked doors, alarm system. Metal detectors are pretty expensive, but you've seen them at courts. I think that's one thing you were talking about, depositions that you may not be comfortable with. If you can go down to the county building where they have those facilities there, make it a little bit safer for you. Definitely a good idea. When it comes to parking, there needs to be adequate lighting in the parking. That's for people who get there early to work when it's dark, and when they leave late when it's dark. We want to try and keep parking separate for employees from the general public ideally. Definitely escorts for people to getting from their cars when they leave, especially at night. And like I said, with this escort thing, you can always raise and lower your security protocols based on the threat that's going on right now. You don't have to be operating at the top level at all times. It's just when you see these potential situations coming up, it's appropriate to raise your level of security.
So this next part, next couple of slides, but I'm at the risk of offending anybody, going to get up on my soapbox a little bit. We're at a profession where confrontation is fairly commonplace. I mean, it's an adversarial system, right? But too many people, we kind of think we're in a club. We get our bar card, and we're in this club where we can be rude and abusive, but everybody knows we're just doing our job. We're kind of kidding about it. And, you know, you can bring violence on yourself depending on how you deal with people, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in the next slide. But this, where we're talking about now, situational awareness is critical. If you walk into a deposition, and it's the most routine deposition in the world, look around. What does a deponent look like? Did they stand up and shake your hand? Do they look angry? You know, are they with a lawyer that you know and you trust? You know, think about that whole situation, and this all can happen very quickly, obviously, but if you're in a situation, I mean, most of our clients tend to be corporate clients. Litigation is something that they don't care for, but it's a business expense. But think about if you're handling a divorce case, or you're maybe working on a foreclosure where the result is somebody's going to lose their family home or things like that. Think about all of those kinds of things. And think about what the lawyer you're dealing with. Is that lawyer going to take control of their client if there's a problem? Is that lawyer going to make the situation worse? And, you know, where do you sit in a deposition? May depend entirely on the circumstances, but particularly if you think that this is a person that's acting a little weird or something, you know, sit closest to the door. Maybe that's the coward's way out because the court reporter's stuck over here, but you're probably the one that's going to be drawing somebody's attention. Sit where you can get out and think about, you know, we were trained when I was a police officer, and I thought it was kind of weird, but over the years I've realized it wasn't, and I'm sure Phil has had this in spades, is think about situations that might develop. Like, I'm walking into a bank to cash a check, but I'm in uniform like Phil is. What am I going to do if somebody jumps out with a gun or whatever? Think through that situation, and in your mind, you always come out where you win. That's natural, but you know, you will actually react that way if a dangerous situation hits. What's going to happen if something crazy, a guy lunged over the table of me in a deposition, and I want to get out the door, you know, I'm going to hit the floor and I'm going to crawl under that table and I'm going to hit the door rolling and going and get out. Just think about those things, and it's not being paranoid. It really is just situational awareness. And if you have, I had a deposition one time where a guy didn't want to come in. He was under subpoena, and I could tell his body language was bad. I could see his jaw muscles clenching, and I asked him about the first 3 questions, and you could tell this guy was not a happy camper. And you know what? I accidentally, you know, I just had a surprise phone call, and I went outside and I said, I'm sorry, we're going to have to terminate this deposition, and I really apologize. And I think in that case we decided we didn't need the deponent that bad, but, you know, reconvene it somewhere else and talk to your opposing lawyers. If you've got a situation, I was threatened once. It was after a hearing. It was outside the other lawyer's presence, and he was a straight-up guy, and I talked to him afterward, and I told him what happened, and he basically helped me resolve the situation, but let them know, because they may have no idea this kind of behavior is going on either, and probably in fairness to them, but they can help you control the situation as well.
You know, I agree 100% with what Doug said, and I would just reiterate that smile and that handshake that you offer at the very beginning goes a long ways. It kind of helps understand, let them play their cards a little bit as to what they're thinking and what their emotional position, you know, what their situation is. You know, I was in Afghanistan in early 2002. And one thing we used to do when we were patrolling through the villages was I would smile and I would wave at people. Everybody had guns over there. Everybody had AK-47s. So that was a non-issue. But I would wave and I would smile. And the people that waved and smiled back were never a real concern for me, but it was when they would just give you that gruff look and then just kind of turn and walk. Those were the people you had to pay attention to, because it's 50-50 chance we're going to get in a firefight later on that day as we're coming back through that village. So that smile and that handshake kind of lets you know where's this person at, what's their thought process right now from the very beginning. So
A little bit that I touched on before, ask yourself, how am the way I'm addressing people going to affect their behavior? We take it for granted. I mean, we have to be in situations. We depose people that don't like us. The clients often see you as the enemy, not just as somebody who's doing your job. And like Phil said, the smile and the handshake does something else too. If you treat people with respect and professionalism, they're going to be a lot less angry at you. I had a case a few years ago, and I promise I won't just start telling a bunch of war stories, but we tried a case, won a large verdict against an individual. He could have settled the case early for almost nothing, and I don't think it bankrupted him, but it seriously depleted his retirement account. And after, when we were walking out of trial, much to my surprise, because I thought the guy hated me, walked up and said, I just want to thank you. I thought you did a good job. You were professional to me. I wish we could have met under different circumstances, but I appreciate the way you treated me. And especially when you're talking about maybe the effect of your action is taking somebody's children away in a divorce or something like that. I've seen lawyers be rude, abusive, dismissive in deposition. I have a good friend of mine. He's not in Arizona. He'd probably get in trouble with the bar, but he has this thing called How to Take a Killer Deposition, and I'm on the attack right out of the box no matter what every time, and I just tell him that's ridiculous. But if you do that, you could be setting yourself for inviting a confrontation that you don't need to have.
yeah, with a person that, in their view, you're taking everything away from them. Maybe their rights to their children, a substantial amount of money. They get desperate, and desperate people do desperate things.
Think about, too, everybody in here, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but everybody in here who's been practicing law for any period of time could name off lawyers that are just complete jerks about everything. And, we have this weird deal where it's okay where we go in court and you go up and say, hi, how are you? And they, everybody launch into you and are rude and tell the judge you lied and did this and that. And we're kind of like, well, it's like the old Bugs Bunny cartoon where the sheepdog and the coyote at the end of the day say, well, Ralph, see you tomorrow, and walk off. We think we don't think about that much. And most of the time, I've heard about lawyers getting in fights with each other in depositions, but there's a pretty easy way to deal with that kind of conduct if they want to keep their license. But, think about that rule. I mean, first of all, we should all act professionally because it's just the right thing to do. But, that rule that you think you might have, I can be a jerk to opposing counsel and it's okay because we both have a bar number. That person, that client, the person sitting with them, they don't have that card and they're not going to see it that way. So really think about how you're treating people. And yes, you have to do your job, and yes, you may have to take a really pointed, difficult deposition, but you don't have to treat somebody poorly while you're doing it.
Okay, we have a couple minutes before we move into the active shooter situation. I have some questions up here, but before I turn to those, are there any questions in the room? Yeah, actually, Lisa, could you bring the microphone right over here? Yes.
Thanks. In terms of planning, planning and practicing your plan, I'm assuming that the same applies to your family. And how important is that practice?
I would say it does. As we're going to get into the active shooter, and you're going to see where these things can happen. They can happen anywhere, and what I'm going to tell you is going to apply the same way. So yes, I would include your family in that. And the last part of the question was about training. How often? Practice. Yeah, I think as long as you're thinking about it and you're discussing it at least annually. If more often than that, even better. But it doesn't take long to rehearse where the exit doors are and how to get out of your office phone onto 911 or through your cell phone, I guess, for that matter, if you've got that, if you can get reception from your office.
And in your home, you have to treat, some people are perfectly comfortable. I mean, I'm sure Phil has a plan in his house if somebody comes in, which is probably going to be different than a lot of other people. I mean, he's armed, he knows how to use his weapons. But make sure your family knows what to do in a situation. Just like if the fire alarm goes off, don't come running to mom and dad's bedroom across the house. Go out that back door and meet in the front. Because the best situation, when I was just single, my wife and I told her, I said, if somebody ever comes in our house in the middle of the night, we're going to get down behind the bed, call 911, and if somebody comes through the door, I'm going to shoot them. But that's it. Otherwise, let's hope the police get here. You know, now my kids are clear on the other side of the house. If somebody comes kicking a door in the middle of the night, I've got some decisions that I have to make because I can't just hide in my bedroom. But know, you know, what are your capabilities, either self-defense wise or otherwise. Make sure, you know, you have some way of calling the police. Cell phones, everybody's got a cell phone now. What if somebody cuts your phone line? Cell phone's going to help you out. If you're relying on a landline, you may be sunk.
My question is about the presence of the police, whether they escalate or de-escalate situations. And I'm actually thinking of two in particular, one where, because of cultural differences, a person who was, the police were trying to stop her for a traffic violation was from another country, and she wouldn't stop because she was in a road where there was not other people. She was afraid she would never be seen or heard from again. So she was going to keep driving until she could find people or a lighted area. The second situation involved a client who I believe was mentally ill. And so we did the procedures that you were talking about. We had a small confined area with a lobby that was separate, and we had a code. I think the code was I was to call the back office and say, could you bring me the blue file? And it actually meant lock the door and call 911, which the staff did. And then they stood by, because there was no other way for them to exit. There was only one exit on the other side of the locked door where I was. And when the police came, the person was more upset that the police were there. And instead of being calming, a police officer got right in the face of the person who was mentally ill and started pointing at the person, making gestures, and telling the person to shut up when he was trying to explain his situation, and didn't understand that he really was somebody who was mentally ill. I mean, he had lost half of his brain in a wartime situation and didn't have short-term memory, and so he would come back to the office daily to ask for a status update, and he wouldn't remember what information had been provided because it was like a Groundhog Day sort of situation.
Yeah, with the first part of the question, you can request officers plainclothes, especially if you're hiring off-duty security thing. Reference the second part. Unfortunately, yes, some officers don't perform as admirably as we would like. Sounds like you were describing a traumatic brain injury. My agency discusses that, and we actually do training quite a bit on that, so hopefully our officers would understand that. But you also have to understand there's a lot of law enforcement personnel from all kinds of agencies, and the amount of training that you're going to see from those officers is going to vary drastically. So,
we probably have, do we want to take one from the web, or?
Okay, a couple of them will fit better in the second
okay.
set, but here's one. And you may not know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and it may also be because, Doug, you're a litigator and you have more experience with depositions and hostile situations. But the question was, it seems you're focusing on depositions. Are depositions the most dangerous situation for lawyers statistically?
I don't know about statistically. I think personally I probably had more confrontations there, although the one time when I was most seriously threatened was when I walked out from a summary judgment hearing. But yeah, look at any situation. It could be meetings. It could be, if you think, I mean, walking out to your car, if you think somebody might be watching for you or whatever. But I would expect probably in terms of assaults, it might be one of the higher places where that occurs, because in court, almost everywhere you're going to go, except some small rural courthouses in Arizona, they do have metal detectors, and that's always an interesting thing too when you're going into court and you know they're having sentencing hearings and things like that, and there's no security. But I would say that's one of the highest ones.
Okay, thank you.
In the interest of time, we'll move on.
Why don't we move on, and then we'll see if we should have time for questions, and we're happy to stick around afterwards for a few minutes as well.
First of all, I want to. We're going to talk about a little bit about what an active shooter situation is, where they happen, and then from there we're going to break it down to two different portions: what you can expect the police to do, what they're going to be doing, and then also we'll end with what I want you to do. Okay? To begin with, you have to understand an active shooter situation. A suspect is actually out there causing death or serious bodily injury right now in an area where there's a lot of potential victims. Okay, from the question over here, we talked about family, home. That probably wouldn't qualify. We're talking about 4 or 5 people. That's not a lot of victims as far as meeting this definition. Also, if they're not in the process of actually shooting or hurting people, then we have more of a hostage situation, and that's going to be dealt with differently. This is what you would consider, like we saw with the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting, what you see in the schools and some of the workplaces where a person just comes in and they just start shooting people. That's exactly what we're talking about here. And let's talk about some of the places where we've seen these happen. Back in Utah, Trolley Square in a shopping mall in 2007, 5 people were killed there, several people were injured. Public locations, remember in 2011, Gabrielle Gifford, where she was giving a speech, 6 people killed there, 3 injured. I already discussed the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, 12 killed there. Schools. There's a lot of schools. That seems to be a popular place for this to happen, and they also happen at work. And there is definitely no sign of this going away. I actually read this in a USA Today article a few months ago, and I was surprised at that second bullet point that in the year following the Aurora, Colorado shooting, there had been 23 of them in 19 states, 126 people killed. That's almost 2 a month, every 2 weeks. I didn't realize it was happening that frequently.
Yeah, one of the things that Phil's touched on a little bit, and will come a little bit more forefront now, is you have to think about if you get a call and you're the police and you start hearing, shots fired. Normally there's multiple calls and you realize it's a real life situation and you're going into this place. First of all, the officers aren't going to come in by themselves almost ever. They're going to come in at least 2, probably more than that. They're going to be at least as scared as you are because they don't have to just hide or whatever. They're the cavalry. They have to intervene. They can't run away. They have to run forward. And you think about what your actions are going to be. If you jump up and start running hysterically toward the officer, you may get yourself shot. I mean, that's just human nature. Think about where are my hands and things like that. When those guys come in, get your hands up. If I see the police in that situation, I'm going to probably be down on my knees, have your hands up, your fingers spread out to them so they know you're signaling to them, I am not a threat. Because you may not be, but if you're grabbing your purse and fumbling for your keys and running out, they may think, oh my God, she's going for a gun. And, if those guys come in much more commonly than when I was an officer, officers are armed with weapons that they have to combat people that are out there, AR-15s, those types of weapons. You don't want to be on the receiving end of one of those types of things. So think about, be calm, take that deep breath. It's easy to say and it's hard to do.
Yeah. Go to next. The first officers responding are not there to treat wounded people. They are simply there to ensure that the perpetrator, the suspect, is no longer able to hurt anybody. The fire department's going to be staged half a mile to a mile down the road waiting to make sure that the scene is clear, that it's safe. So it's normal for them to just get beyond, the training is just get beyond the wounded people, injured people, and go straight to the shooter. So understand that that's what's going to happen. This is kind of a typical technique that we use. 4 officers is what my agency recommends a minimum of. As you can see, only the first officer has a uniform on. Realize that officers, when this call goes out, plainclothes detectives, undercover detectives, everybody's going to be showing up for this. They may not all look like police officers, but they should be in groups. Okay, minimum 3, we prefer 4 or 5. Responding officers are probably going to be patrol officers and not SWAT. What does that mean? Well, SWAT officers have a lot more training in firearms and how to deal with situations like this, hostage situations, active shooter situations, than patrol officers do. We train more. When I was on the SWAT team, I was also a sniper as well as on the entry team. I trained 6 days out of the month. I did training, SWAT training. Officers don't get nearly that kind of training. We just can't afford to do it. Our officers, at least at my agencies, have had training, active shooter training scenarios that they've gone through. I think we've done it twice over the years. But, you know, it may be a few years since they've been through this kind of a situation. When they're coming up, when they're responding there, they're going to have bad information. You attorneys are familiar with, if you've ever had witnesses, you know that witness testimony is notoriously bad, although it goes great on the stand for some reason. It's just not, it's not real reliable. And especially when people are terrified and trying to explain what they're seeing, it just comes out wrong. So the information's going to be, it's going to be outdated, and it's going to be inaccurate information. And by outdated, things can change rapidly in the span of 15 to 20 seconds. He's gone from one floor to another floor. Go ahead.
Kind of just following up in a little bit more detail and kind of putting yourself in the mind of the person that's going to be coming to get you out of this situation. The worst thing you can do is contribute to the chaos by screaming or yelling or running around or whatever. You know, they're under enough stress as it is. You know, there will be people that won't heed what I'm saying or didn't get to come today, and they'll go running over the police, screaming and yelling. And you can actually, if it's a coworker, you can do a lot to calm those people down. You know, just like get out on the floor, stop screaming. You know, because the more of that confusion there is, the more likely, A, one of the officers may get hurt, the suspect may get away, or somebody else gets hurt. So, and keep in mind, too, for example, in the Columbine situation, as the slide notes, that this guy came in with explosive devices. You can be in situations like that. A friend of mine in Oklahoma City got a bank robbery call in. The guy didn't have a gun. He was wearing a dress like a woman. He weighed about 250 pounds, and he had a bomb. It turned out not being a bomb. They found out later after he'd been shot. But, you know, there are those types of things. So even if the suspect is neutralized, it doesn't mean the situation isn't still dangerous.
Yeah, important thing to remember is the police officers, they're human just like you are. They're terrified just like you are. Their heart rate's really high. The sweating, they've probably never been to anything like this before in their life. I know I might be asking a lot, but do what you can to try to stay calm. If you can imagine, just in this room here, we've probably got 50 some odd people. I'm showing up on a scene, and it's chaotic. People are running all over the place, and I've got to find the one person out of that group that's trying to kill people, including me, now that I'm there. And people are running around screaming with things in their hands or whatever. You can imagine how difficult that would be for me to try and pick out who that person is. This is an actual picture from the cafeteria at Columbine High School. You can see one of the bombs there, the propane tank in the bottom right. There was actually two explosive devices just like that at the school. So some of the things we have to worry about as law enforcement. So we talked about what police are going to be doing. This is what I want you to do. These are your three options. You can run, you can hide, you can fight. And those are the priority that you need to focus on. Run first. If you can't escape, then hide. And God forbid you get found, you need to fight. Okay?
And one of the things, you know, I don't think probably as lawyers we think this way, you know, like, well, gee, if I cut and run, I'm not doing my job or something. But you know what? It's not the time to be a hero if you're not armed, if you're not trained, if you don't have the backup. The best thing you can do is get out of there. If you can help coworkers, you know, find a way to get out or warn them if you know of a situation. Don't just run out and leave everybody else sitting there. Don't take anything. Don't take your purse. A cell phone's not a bad idea, but I'm still careful about having things in your hands. You know, no possession you have is worth getting hurt over or losing your life. So just get the heck out of there. And, you know, one of the things that I want to stress is if you get in a situation, and I told you, you know, that cold fear hits you. I had the other night, it was late at night, and my alarm went off in my house. And it turned out to be a false alarm. But, you know, you have that minute of just like, oh, crap, you know, this is scary stuff. But if you get in a point, if you're in a deposition and somebody comes up with a knife or a gun and you can't just get out, or whatever your situation, the worst thing you can ever do, in my opinion, is to go down on your knees with a gun in the back of your head. I'd rather be facing them, fighting. You know, you got things, everybody here, this isn't a very good example because I've got one of these keyless fobs, but my wife has one you push a button on. It's like a little switchblade key. That is a great weapon. Grab that thing, and all you want is separation. Stick it right in somebody's eyeball, get the separation so you can get out. You can roll up, you know, a newspaper. You can roll up a piece of paper like this. It's an effective weapon. You can hit somebody with it. And I'm not advocating that we go around, you know, saying, all right, well, I'm in the depot, I'm ready for a fight. But if you get in that situation, fight, kick, scream, bite, gouge eyes, no rules in this fight. And then, because the biggest thing is most of the time, you can get a separation, and then you can run. Because I'm not Phil. He's got to go in and get this person and handcuff them and take them to jail. All I have to do is go home to my family that night.
Don't try to take wounded people out. That sounds pretty cold and pretty harsh, but the fact of the matter is you cannot move as fast carrying somebody or dragging somebody as that person can move just carrying a gun. Okay? Keep your hands visible, like the picture here. Open. Fingers spread. We do that because, like I said, you can take your cell phone with you, but not in your hands. Put it in a pocket, waistband, stick it down a shirt, I don't care. You don't want it in your hands. And the reason why is, I'm that officer, I'm showing up on the scene, like I was telling you, I'm scared to death. My heart rate's 180 beats a minute. I just want to live too, right? And this little vest I'm wearing is feeling really, really small, and it probably won't stop the rifle bullets if this guy's got a rifle anyway, okay? So I'm terrified, I'm trying to find somebody, and you come rushing at me, screaming from the side. I look over and I see, and all of a sudden my mind sees your black cell phone or your silver cell phone or your keys, whatever it is in your hand, and my brain says gun, and I shoot. Okay? I didn't mean to shoot you. I'm sorry I shot you, but that doesn't change the fact that now you're shot because you didn't listen to what I just told you. Keep your hands empty. Okay? Police officer taught from the first day, first week of the police academy, hands kill people. I want to see your hands. Okay, every officer's going to want to see your hands. Show them your hands when you're coming out, just like this. Okay, I feel better, and you want me to feel better because I've got a gun in my hand when I'm coming to find this guy, right? Okay. When officers do arrive, follow their instructions. Call 911 only when it's safe to do so. I'm telling you this one more time. Okay, don't carry anything in your hands. Let's say you weren't able to get out in time. You weren't able to escape. Now you have to hide. Stay out of view. There's a real quick thing I want to talk about. Cover and concealment. They're not the same. Cover stops bullets. Concealment keeps you from view. Bulletproof glass is cover, but it's not concealment. I would take the cover over concealment every single time. A bush, he may not be able to see you, but the bullets go right through that. Okay? You want, ideally, cover. You want something that's going to stop bullets.
One trick that you don't think of, if somebody came in here right now and started shooting, everybody here has a defensive tool right in front of you. Tip that desk over, get behind it, and turn it at an angle to the shooter, because it's, you know, probably most firearms, handguns will go through that, probably just some kind of pressed wood, but if you get it at an angle, the bullets will deflect. So think about that, you know, there, because that's concealment, but it also can be cover. And so, again, just take advantage of your surroundings if you can't get out of there.
When you have an opportunity to call 911, they're going to want to know where the shooter is, how many shooters, what their description is, what kind of weapons they have. Simple, it's a handgun, it's a long gun, it looks like a rifle. And then the number of potential victims. And by that, how many people work at your building is kind of that information that law enforcement's going to be needing. You weren't able to escape, you tried to hide. Worst possible situation is you were found. You need to fight as hard as you can, because quite frankly your life depends on it. I recommend using improvised weapons. You want to try and control that gun, get it away from you. Okay? It's not like the movies where if you stab somebody with your letter opener, they're going to drop dead. He probably won't even know he's been stabbed. Lots of times we've had officers that have been stabbed in fights and they didn't realize they were stabbed until that adrenaline wore off, and then it hurt like hell. But letter openers, scissors, your keys, Fire extinguishers, hitting somebody over the head with that. Aim for the face and the throat. Those are the areas you need to aim for. It sounds brutal, but that's the reality of it. I think we kind of discussed this already, but once they arrive, avoid the urge to rush towards officers. You're terrified. The officers are terrified. You see salvation in that officer, and you just want to get there and get behind them as quick as you can. Just chill, show your hands, and follow the instructions of the officers. They're going to move right past you, and then I want you to follow where they just came from. Okay? Hands out, because there's probably more officers coming in. Don't scream. Please don't scream. Please don't make it more distracting than it already is. The officer's trying to process a lot of things right now. And your screaming is only taking him away from his mission, which is trying to focus on where this bad guy is and how do I get to him and how do I stop him from what he's doing. Okay.
I'm just going to go over a couple of slides and then we'll turn it over to questions because I know a lot have come in and I assume a lot of you have questions that are follow-up. In your packet of materials, we have listed a number of online resources. I wanted to point out the YouTube video in particular. It's worth watching this. It's hard for most of us. I know I fortunately have not been involved in any of these situations, but I'm not sure I would know what to do, but listening to them and watching some of these videos, reading these online resources are helpful. The next slide, we have circled the, sorry, it's really small on that computer, the Fema Active Shooter Guide. Some of the information that we had here today is consistent with what you'll read there. There's also a community response checklist for an active shooter incident. There's things that you can do both to prepare and after an incident occurs so that you can hopefully prevent it from happening to you or others again in the future. I think we all unfortunately learn a lot from every situation that occurs, and so if you are one that experiences it and you actually go through the process of analyzing why it happened and what went wrong, it may help others. There's some webinars, there's courses available that we have pointed out, and that's basically it. I don't need to go over each of these because I know that it's more important to ask questions to these experts that are up here. So are there any questions in the audience, and then I'll turn to some of the ones that have come in from web participants.
Mediation or ADR situations, as a mediator, you know going in that you've got heightened emotions and two sides coming together, both of whom are carrying some baggage with them. Is there some safety recommendation that you would hope that you could impart to a mediator or a person that's going to engage in ADR that will help them to keep safe, but also to facilitate the mediation going forward?
Well, I'm a judge pro tem, so I've done a lot of mediations, in a court-appointed setting, and that's an excellent question. You're going to be going back and forth between 2 or 3 rooms, but you've got the ability to size everybody up and assess the situation. And a lot of times will pull the lawyers aside before we start and say, is there anything I need to know? What are the emotions of this case? Because that can help me with settlement. But is there somebody who's particularly volatile? I tend to like to get everybody together at the beginning just to kind of state the ground rules so I don't have to do it 2 or 3 times. But if, you ask somebody that and they may say, my client really hates that other person and I think it'd be better to keep them separated. And then watch the situation, and if you start seeing the dynamics that aren't looking right, I had one not too long ago that I terminated in the middle of a mediation because one of the participants was starting to get borderline violent, and I just said, sorry, I had something come up, we're going to have to reschedule it. But I went and told I had the other people leave first. It wasn't at a point, where the person wasn't physical, it was a small person. I could see that they weren't armed, and so I was comfortable enough just walking them out and sending them down. It didn't escalate to the point of violence, but use that time because you'll get valuable information, and ask the lawyers because they'll tell you. Take them out and I like to talk to the participants, because first of all, they're the one that has to make a decision to settle or not. So talking to them the lawyers are going to sit there and argue like they always do, and like I do when I'm in that situation. So you can get a lot of information, but you can you can gain a lot, and when you're watching that body language, and if you start seeing somebody that they're just not acting the way you think they ought to be acting, you know what, back off and reschedule it somewhere in a safe place.
I think you had a question over here.
I'd just like to share a couple of thoughts. I used to have my own sole practice office building, and alarm systems are incredibly cheap, and you can get panic buttons that you wear around your neck that can send a silent alarm. And I encourage any solos and especially small firms out there to get something like that for all of their staff. And it works outside the building when you're walking to your car, outside the building. Also, the court security here will escort you to your car after a court session if you ask them to. It can be arranged in Maricopa County and possibly in other courts around the country. I want to suggest a book called The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker, which discusses trusting your instincts and how to sense situations and deal with them. It's totally valuable. I've given it to all kinds of people as gifts. It's a very good book.
Those are great points. Thank you for sharing. On one of your points, and then I'll come to your question, it's consistent with what you were saying. So one of the questions online was, is it better if I'm in a small office and we have an alarm system in place, like you were talking about? I don't know if yours is a silent or a loud alarm, but the question from the person here is, would it be better to set off the loud alarm, the piercing bell, or would it be better not to do that so that you can't hear what's going on?
The benefit of the loud alarm is it lets people know in the back office what's going on. They need to know to get out. That's the benefit of that. The downside is, yeah, it makes it a little harder for officers because they can't necessarily hear where the shooting is going on. But if you can notify people to get out now, and they know that alarm, that's what it means, I would recommend doing that anyway.
Okay, thank you. Over here, yes.
Thanks. Most of us work in office buildings where there's all manner of business being conducted in other offices in the building. So you're in your own office and you hear shots that might have come from down the hall. What do you want us to do?
Get out.
Get out.
Yes.
So, because we don't know what's going on in the hall or where that noise came from.
Yeah, we don't know what the motive of what that shooting is about. They could be for revenge and they're just there for the one person. It could just be they've lost it and they're just going to start shooting people. You need to get out. Get out of the building. It's not your.
Don't
you don't
try
need to concern
hide.
yourself.
You're saying don't try to hide in our own office.
If you
get out of the building.
If you cannot escape, it's not safe to escape, because if you have to run past where the shooting is going on, I would hide. Stay in and hide. Ideally, you want to run first, get out first. If you can't get out, I want you to hide in your office. Close the door, lock it, turn off the light. Make sure you're out of sight, silence your cell phone, and pretend that like no one's there that day.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions in the audience? If not, yes. We'll wait for the microphone.
Lawyers very often are involved with people I think they call the patriots, the freedmen. They don't believe in our laws. They won't give us their name. They threaten to sue us if we put their name on a document. This is like a pre-violence thing. It's a they're not mentally ill. They've got their own support networks, and it seems to me that maybe we ought to have a phased-in thing where the receptionist may have one course of action, which might be to get somebody else to get them away from the reception area. And have you had any experience, or do you have any tips on it?
I've had to deal with, we call them constitutionalists, freemen. Typically, the only law enforcement they recognize is the sheriff, because he was an elected law enforcement official. I have had to deal with him in the past, and if I have a violation, I deal with them, I cite them, I arrest them. I don't care if they recognize my authority as a law enforcement officer or not. As for attorneys in dealing with a person like that, I think you just need to be as cordial as you can be. They may not give you information that you're asking for, personal information or whatnot, but I don't know what your legal rights would be.
That's one where I actually got sued by one of those guys once because I represented a client in he hadn't paid his taxes or something. I don't know how I got sued, but we did get it dismissed. But somebody like that, there's no reason for them to ever be at your office, right? I mean, if you're going to depose them or something like that, do it in a safe place, because you don't know what they're capable of. And, you know, I've had people that I've told them before, like when another client showed up at our office, and I told them and I told their lawyer, you are never, ever, ever to come here, you know, unless it's a you know, duly noticed proceeding or something like that. And if one of those people shows up after you've told them that, you know, have your staff just call the police right away and get them out. Because, again, you got to read the threat level. Some of those folks don't recognize authority, but I don't think they're violent. The ones that were sued me and some other people, I mean, that guy I thought was pretty nuts.
Okay, I'll turn to a couple questions, and then we have about 2 minutes left. So one of the questions was, Phil, this will be for you. If you are in an active shooter situation and you do not know the shooter, so you're someone, they're not there to get you, you don't have any personal experience with them, and the police have arrived, but apparently, according to this question, the shooting is still ongoing. How do you know, you showed a slide with some plainclothesmen police officers. How do you know who's the shooter and who might be someone who's there legitimately? And what should you do?
You know, in Afghanistan, we knew who the bad guys were because the paint on our truck started chipping from their bullets. If the person's actively shooting while they're moving, that's probably not the police officer. Okay, police officer is looking for one or two individual, or three, however many there are. We usually don't get situations with more than one or two. They're looking for specific people. Whereas the suspect is actually, they're just looking for any moving threat they can.
The police are going to most of the time be identifying themselves. They're probably going to have a badge or something, but their demeanor is going to be generally different. It's going to be deliberate. They're going to probably be telling people, get down, you know, police. I mean, normally you want to identify yourself, but, you know, it's a good question. And if you don't know who it is,
groups of four is probably going to be your officers moving in a concerted effort, like they have an idea what they're doing, whereas the situations, I know Columbine had two shooters, but most of these shooters are going to be an individual walking through just shooting people. So.
Okay, one final question, unless there's someone in the audience that's dying to ask something. This is from a person who says, if I'm a female manager of a small firm and the panic alarm goes off, should I enter the room where the panic alarm was triggered to assess the situation, or just call law enforcement? And I think, Phil, I may be able to answer this one for you, that I think the police would rather come to a situation where they're not needed than have someone go in an unarmed, untrained way and say, hey, can I help, what's going on here? But am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Get law enforcement on the way right now. And like I said, if you're hearing gunshots, get out. If it's a panic alarm, call 911, let them know, hey, we've got a panic alarm going on, I don't know what's happening. The address, as much as information as you can give. If you have some other people that can go in and assist, by all means, but get law enforcement rolling first. If you go in there to try and help out and you both end up getting hurt, no one's going to know unless there's someone else that, you know, help's not on the way at that point. So get help on the way first.
Well, thank you all. Oh, do we have time? Is everybody okay staying? We're 2 minutes over our end time.
I came in late, so if this was discussed, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
One of the things that I was thinking about as I was listening to all the questions is that it appears that there are attorneys who represent on an ongoing basis clients with whom they have a lot of difficulty, potential violence. They've had opposing counsel have had problems. And so my question is, what's the expectation for an attorney to continue, and I had this situation recently, to continue to deal with a client whom you think is potentially dangerous, if not to you, to others?
I think I'll let Doug answer that. That's sort of an ethical question, and I actually wanted to point out that several of the questions that have come in online we haven't had time to answer. Some of them have ethical implications, like how do I withdraw? What if my client is threatening someone? What do I do? When do my ethical, you know, Phil probably he's probably learned this in law school last year, the case where the psychologist is told by her patient that he's about to go kill his ex-wife. When do your duties of confidentiality, when does a dangerous situation trump your duties of confidentiality? Doug served on our firm's, do you still serve on our firm's ethical committee? So you may be able to answer the withdrawal question.
Well, I mean, my view is if I have somebody who is going to treat me unprofessionally, much less if I'm afraid of them, I'm not going to represent them. And it's easy to say, I suppose, if you're starting a practice and you're scraping by or whatever, but you know what? No business is worth getting killed over, and life is just too short to even deal with people who are just jerks. I mean, tell them and sit them down. I mean, I've had clients that you sit them down and you say, you know what, you are not going to talk to me that way. You're not going to talk to my staff that way. And this isn't even threatening, but you know what, cut them loose, just not worth it.
Well, thank you so much for attending. If there's interest in future seminars, the panel up here, and we're willing to bring in other experts. This is obviously a very important subject that unfortunately is impacting not only lawyers but our community at large. So we'll be up here for a little while if you have any questions for one of the panelists individually. Thank you.